this is the customer preparation phase. We actually will interview the customer on a conference call and give them a pre-installed checklist to fill out. We'll go over the checklist and tell you what important parts on the checklist we actually need to go over. So first thing we do when we talk to the customer and set up an interview or conference call is to go over some of the hardware requirements for the system. So we want to make sure there's enough available rack space. So depending on which node you have and how many number of node, we need to have adequate amount of rack space. We need to make sure that we have enough adequate power as well too, as well as the voltage in the data center as well. Obviously, we want to be running over redundant circuits for full redundancy. We also want to interview them to see what kind of network switches they have and to see if we're able to go ahead and have the network switches configured correctly for the Nutanix system, whether they're using VLANs, trunked VLANs, and if they are, whether we can set native VLANs over to the same subnet as where, or VLAN as where the controller virtual machines and hypervisor IP addresses are set to. So we'll go over the Excel spreadsheet really quickly and highlight some of the details that we need in the spreadsheet. So this is a sample cluster configuration. Here we have, in the first area here, was the DNS servers. So these are DNS servers for both the hypervisor and the controller virtual machines. Next is the NTP servers. So this is the NTP servers for both the hypervisor and the controller virtual machine. So we want to make sure that we have NTP servers available. Next would be the SMTP relay. And this is where we actually have, we can send SMTP alerts to both the customer as well as Nutanix support as well. And then some additional SMTP information, as well as the email addresses that we actually can send to alerts over to the customer. Next would be the Active Directory domain. This is more important in a Hyper-V setup environment, not quite so important in Acropolis or ESX environment, but if we are setting up in that environment, we want to make sure that it corresponds to the same DNS domain that the customer has as well too. We also want to make sure that we set up the host DNS addresses for the IP addresses for everything that we put in as well too, as best practice. The cluster administrator AD group as well as the read-only AD group depends on if it's a Hyper-V environment, we want to actually be able to give correct permissions to correct groups in Active Directory. If they're running Prism Central, we want to make sure we have the Prism Central DNS name as well as an IP address for Prism Central as well too. A syslog server is optional, and this is ability to log the system logs on the Nutanix. If they're using SNMP, we want to make sure that we have the trap set correctly for SNMP, as well as the trap destination. And if the firewalls are there, or if they're wanting to use their own certificates, or if they're willing or okay with using self-signed certificates for the environment. And you also want to make sure to see if the CVMs have availability to the internet. This gives the ability for the CVMs to actually go ahead and phone home to Nutanix for any alerts as well too. Now we go over to the cluster resources, and this is where we actually give the cluster name and the cluster IP address. The cluster IP address is the virtual IP address for the entire cluster, as well as the DNS names. And if we're running a vSphere environment, we have the vCenter names, the vCenter cluster, and what vSwitches we have on the vCenter environments. Next would be setting up the network configuration for the hypervisor, vMotion, and Nutanix CVM, as well as the IPMI addresses that we fill out here. And we can see if we're running different VLANs, we want to enter the correct VLAN information on here. And just remember that for the hypervisor and controller virtual machines, they need to be on the same, IP addresses need to be on the same subnet as each other. The IPMI addresses can be on a different subnet if needed. So again, network range, subnet mask, default gateway for all of that. And then we get down into the actual nodes themselves. And so we need a couple IP addresses for each node. We need an IP address for the hypervisor. We need an IP address for the controller virtual machines. And we need an IP address for the IPMI address as well too. The vMotion IP address can be different or it could be the same as the hypervisor, depending on the network, depending on the customer's preference on that. And you want to make sure to go ahead and fill that in for all the nodes that we're going to be installing for the customer. Using the information in the worksheet, we're able to go ahead and configure the cluster in the next step.